Good day, everyone. Hope you're enjoying this study through the book of Proverbs. This is the fifth section in our study through the book, so we will be covering today chapter 5. Again, in the interest of trying to keep these videos short, I'm going to abstain from reading the whole chapter, but I do hope that you will read it on your own. This is a very good chapter. Again, another good chapter specifically for men. Not to say that women can't benefit from this. So we have to change some of the verbiage to reflect a female viewpoint. But this is specifically something that's given again. This is the entire chapter is an admonition from the wise father. We continue during that trend. And the whole chapter is an admonition from the wise father to his son. This chapter specifically regards sexuality. The entire chapter relates to sexual maturity, sexual wisdom, and sexual fidelity, as a father would try to give some advice and some admonition to his son. And so he starts out in verses 2 and 3 by making a quick comparison before he actually gets into what he wants to tell his son. In verse 2 he says that you may regard discretion and that your lips may keep knowledge. Now, so again, this is kind of a hearkening back to chapter 4 where we're talking about having guarded knowledge and committing things within yourself. But he says, I want you to guard what you say. And this is not something that's foreign to the Bible in any way. The Bible makes a lot of claims, such as in the New Testament. At one point it says, let no filthy communication proceed out of your mouth. People of God are supposed to have speech that rises above the level of the average person. We're not supposed to talk like everybody else and talk about the things that everybody else talks. Leonard Ravenhill used to make a point that it disgusted him that you could go to church and inside the doors of the church everybody was rather quiet, but as soon as they stepped outside they no further got than the porch outside the church that they were talking about baseball and Star Wars and all the things of the earth. And he said, you can tell that it didn't make any difference in their lives. The things that just happened inside the doors were no different. And a Christian is supposed to be different. They're supposed to talk about things that relate to God. They're supposed to talk about their salvation and their testimony. Their conversations are supposed to be meaningful and not trivial. Their language is supposed to reflect the fact that they've been changed, the fact that Christ, through the Holy Spirit, has come into them and lives in them. But he compares that in verse 3 with the lips of the strange woman, for they drop as honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. And this is interesting because contrarily to what he's commending him to do, he says, guard your lips. He says, the strange woman, her lips drop like honeycomb, her mouth is smoother than oil. So what is he talking about there? Well, number one, her lips speak flattery. She makes you feel good. And I hate to drop names, but man, this is a Joel Osteen kind of verse right here. The lips flatter, and also they are persuasive. Her mouth is smoother than oil. There are some people in life that you can reflect on this. They could convince you to jump off a bridge. We almost look at this as a positive thing. They're always finding good in something. But when someone can find good in evil, that's really where the devil likes to play. The devil never makes somebody choose between good and bad. The devil makes people choose between good and great. And so, in our eyes, something is never going to be black and white like that. It's never going to be obvious that something is evil or wicked. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be tempting to us. We wouldn't consider it if we knew that it was wicked. It's when something seems like a decent idea. And that's what the father is telling his son here. He says, when you step outside of the commitments that you've made, as we'll find out later in the chapter, he says the women that are going to try to seduce you in a way, or the women that you're going to be attracted to, are going to be women who they talk like honeycomb. Everything they say is sweet and nice and flattering, and their words are smoother than oil. I mean, they're just absolutely smooth talkers, and they make everything seem like it's going to be okay. These are the kind of women that you're going to come into. And that's what he says, is that he introduces this woman in verses 3 through 6. The immoral woman is introduced as being alluring, but deadly. We can see that here. We just read about her speech, verse 4. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold on hell, lest you should ponder the path of life. Her ways are movable, that you cannot know them. So this kind of person is always adapting, and it doesn't actually necessarily have to be one person individually. This could be a group of people or a type of person. You know, there's so many people that they bounce between lovers so often, and they actually adapt to themselves because the person that shows them any form of affection or shows them any form of love requires them to act and look and be a certain way. And it gets to the point where they've adapted themselves so much that they don't even know who they are anymore. They don't really have an identity. Their only identity is found in the person that they're trying to appeal to. And so this goes for men and women. But he says this person's going to be movable. You're never going to know what's going on with them. They're not going to be solid. They're not going to be grounded. They're not concrete. You can't get a grasp on them. And this is the opposite of what you want in an actual relationship. In a relationship, you want solidarity. You want somebody that you can depend on, somebody you can rely on always being there. But this is the kind of person that you couldn't depend on, you couldn't rely on them, you can't trust them. He says that's the kind of person you're going to run into that's going to try to take you down this evil path. Now in verses 7 through 14, the father just explicitly exhorts his son to stay away from this kind of woman. And so he says to do so in verses 7 and 8 by doing something that he told him to do in the last chapter. So we'll find out here. He says, Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way from her, and come not nigh to the door of her house. Catch that in verse 7. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. There again, this is a message that it is important, it is crucial to commit wise words and scriptures to memory. It's not enough to know that you can find them in the Bible. You have to commit them to yourself. You have to memorize some scriptures and some wise words so that they are always with you, to have them engraved on your heart. This is very, very important. He says, I want you to commit my words and do not leave them. Remove your way far from her. Do not come to the door of her house. Now verses 9 through 14 begins to give some of the consequences of failing to follow his admonition. The consequences of going after this woman outside of the marriage bed. It says, your honor will be given to others. Your years will be given to the cruel. Strangers will be filled with your wealth. Your labor will be in the house of a stranger. You will mourn at the last, and when your flesh and your body are consumed, you will say, How have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof? I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, neither did I incline my ear to them that instructed me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. So the first thing that he says here is that there are things that you're supposed to enjoy that are going to be taken away from you, and they're going to be angled in such a way by your own actions that they're going to be punishments. So we look there in verses 9 and 10. Your honor and your years. These are things that you're supposed to be enjoying. You're supposed to, as you age, enjoy honor. We have this idea in America specifically of respecting your elders, but in other societies it's even more important. In China and other places in Asia, it's very important to respect the elders. They're almost deified in their aged years. And so he says the honor that you're supposed to receive in your aged years, you're going to receive none of it. And it's actually going to go to somebody else. The years that you receive are going to be given to the cruel. So the punishments of your infidelity are going to be not just the taking away of blessings, but you're going to have to watch as the blessings that you could have received are given to others. Verse 10, strangers will be filled with your wealth, and your labor in the house will be in the stranger. You're going to put a lot of work in and receive none of the benefits of it. You're not going to receive the reward of your suffering. You're going to lose the benefits of the things that you put so much work into because of your infidelity. It's not a joke. Now it seems clear if you read verse 11, and you will mourn at the last when your flesh and your body are consumed. This almost sounds like a description of an STD, which you know very well that people that are sexually promiscuous are much more likely to contract STDs. Now we know that. But this is also something that hedonists in general need to realize, that in the end of your life, when you mourn at your last, you're not going to be glad that you enjoyed the life that you did. I think of Oscar Wilde. For anybody that's familiar with Oscar Wilde, he's a very famous author and poet, and in his day, I believe he lived in the 1800s in England, he was one of the first to actually come up with the idea that hedonism was the right way to go. And for those of you that aren't familiar, hedonism is the idea that the purpose of life is to enjoy life. That's the whole point of it. And so you do whatever makes you happy. You have sex with whoever you want. If you don't want to be in a marriage anymore, you leave the marriage. If you don't want to have any responsibility for your kids anymore, you leave your kids. If you want to have kids, you have them. If you don't, you abort them. Life is just all about you. If you don't like your job, you quit. You don't keep commitments that you don't want to keep. Your word is not your bond. It's really just selfishness embodied in a philosophy. Excuse me, as I'm wiping my face. I shaved my face and I've got hair all over my face. Should have wiped myself down. But at the end of his life, Oscar Wilde, he was gay, and he had contracted, I believe it was syphilis, and his lover, his name was Robbie, was there with him in his last days. And as he's lying on his deathbed, he calls out to Robbie and he says, "Robbie, of all of the men that you've loved in your life, have you ever loved them for their sake?" And that's an interesting question that a hedonist would ask. Because what he's admitting is that of all the things that he's done, he's never done anything for somebody else's sake, not even loving them. He always knew that he loved them for his own sake. He loved them because it made him feel good. And so that's what he said. "Robbie, of all the men that you've loved, have you ever loved any of them for their sake?" And Robbie said, "No." And Oscar Wilde said, "Neither have I." And he tells Robbie, he says, "Call a priest." And Oscar Wilde has a very late deathbed conversion, but you can tell that his philosophy on life was filled with regret, because even to this day, his very headstone has a quote from the book of Job, which is a book filled with regret and questions and suffering. So this man who lived his entire life trying to please himself and live in total hedonism, he's entombed in a grave that has an epitaph from one of the saddest books in the Bible. He realized that his entire life had been spent worthlessly, just pursuing vain things that didn't actually ultimately fulfill him. And even on his deathbed, in the presence of his lover, he knew that he had never loved anybody for their own sake. However, Christ had loved everyone only for their own sake. He gained nothing from loving them, and he lost everything by loving them. So he identified with this great love that's embodied in the person of Christ. So, verse 11, just coming back to that, trying to live a life that totally pleases yourself at the cost of morality and righteousness and holiness and the cost of other people will ultimately leave you depraved. And you're going to be spiritually bankrupt in your last days. Verses 15 through 20 give a brief but powerful explanation of biblical sexuality. They're very clear and unapologetic about the fact that sexuality is supposed to be good and that it's supposed to be enjoyed. However, it's only supposed to be good and enjoyed within the confines of marriage. And when you put it in those parameters, and you also understand that the biblical definition for marriage is one man and one woman, you understand that this is very specific. One man and one woman for life, as a matter of fact. So, verses 15 through 18, these would be easy to misunderstand, but I want you to understand that anytime that they give a metaphorical representation or a symbol for water, they're referring to this person's wife. And so anytime that we talk about water in these 15 through 18, these three verses, it's referring to his wife. So let's look here. It says, "Drink water out of your own cistern, running water out of your own well. Let your fountains be dispersed abroad and rivers of waters in the streets. Do not let them be yours only, and not a stranger's with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth." That verse 18 is the one that clarifies this fountain and these waters and cisterns and springs and rivers that we're talking about. It's your wife. And he says you need to understand that you're supposed to drink water out of your own cistern. You're supposed to receive your sexual fulfillment from your own wife. This is supposed to be your and your wife's way of expressing love for one another in a physical way. And you're not supposed to step out on that. Now, one thing that could easily be misunderstood, specifically in the King James Version, is verse 16. When it says, "Let your fountains be dispersed abroad and rivers of the waters in the streets." He's not saying to allow that to happen. if you read other translations, specifically like the ESV or the New Living Translation, it seems like God is or the Father here at least, is putting this thought in his mind. He says, exactly how would you respond if your wife was out in the street making a harlot of herself? If the love that you felt was strictly to be used by yourself and your wife, what would you do if that was strewn about in the streets and other people were allowed to enjoy it? How would you like it if other people were committing adultery with your wife? And this is the sort of comparison that he's making, so be very clear on that verse, but also understand that he's trying to make the point. You're supposed to enjoy sex within your own confines of your marriage. Verses 19 and 20, he goes so far, he starts literally describing the way that he's supposed to be fulfilled by his wife. He's very unapologetic about this. So I want us to be mature in this, but to be clear on the language. He says, let her be as the loving hind and the pleasant roe. Another translation would call that deer. It's just a pleasant kind of animal. Let her breast satisfy you at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman, and embrace the bosom of a stranger? Now I want to focus in on the word ravished in that, because the translation from the Hebrew literally means to be swept away. And that you could compare that to the phraseology that we use today, to get carried away, or maybe even to say we fall in love. We're very obvious in the way that we look at love, and we see that there's some element of it that we're not in control of. We don't step into love. We don't grab love. We fall into it. And that's what he's saying here. You're supposed to be ravished and swept away and fall in love with your wife. And so this is very different from the way that we look at it in American society. The biblical mandate is that you control who you love. That you're supposed to be carried away in love only with one person. And in America, we would say that that'd be impossible to do, because we believe in things like love at first sight and falling in love in a true sense where you have no control over it. He says, no, you are to be only ravished away in love with your wife. He says, why would you allow that to happen to you with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? He says, that's not your place. So in the Bible, we're told that love is in fact, at least to some degree, your choice. You determine who you love and who you are in love with, okay? You have a decision to make. And you don't just fall in love with somebody and say, well, I don't love my wife anymore, but I know I'm in love with this person, and love is good, and God is love, and God wants me to be happy, and He wants me to be in love with who I'm married to, so I really need to divorce my wife and be with that person. The Bible does not support that. The Bible does not condone that. There is absolutely no foundation for that. That is an American way of thinking about it, and it is wrong. God does not say that, okay? You love who you are married to by choice, because you chose to marry them. So, verses 21 through 23 concludes with a brief account of the woes that befall an immoral man. So, these final two verses use poetic language to conclude the proverb, in that they finish by saying that the person who is carried away to such a degree that they feel like they don't have control over it anymore will ultimately be carried into the confines of a trap. We'll read that, verses 21 through 23. For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and He ponders all of His goings. His own iniquities will take the wicked man himself, and he will be held by the cords of his sins. He will die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he will have gone astray. So it uses the same analogy of somebody falling in love, or being taken in love, or to go astray in love, to be carried away in love, taken away. He says, when you're taken away and you don't have control over who you're taken away by, you will fall, and the folly will be great. The greatness of your folly will cause you to go astray. You will ultimately be taken by your own wickedness, and you will be held in the cords of sin. So it's almost a proverb against being carried away outside of control in love. And he says, those that allow themselves to be carried by love and do not carry love inside of their own marriage, that love that they are carried away by will carry them to sin, and it'll carry them to a prison where they are held by their sins and their wickedness. So, the admonition here, be very careful about your sexual expression. It is strictly confined to the expression within marriage, which is a lifelong commitment between one man and one woman. To go outside of that is not permissible under the construct that you've fallen in love or been carried away in love. It's still not okay. It's not allowed. The Bible is very clear on that. And it even says that the person who claims to be fallen in love or carried away in love with somebody outside of their marriage is still to be carried away by their own sin into the prison of their own sin that locks them down and ultimately holds them until they die. So, that's a very swift look through Proverbs chapter 5. I hope that you've gained something from this study. Leave a comment and share the video if you would. I'd love to hear your reflections on this as we move continually through the book of Proverbs. I hope that you're gaining some insight, and I'd love to hear some feedback on it. If you have insights that I'm not going over, I'd love to have a deeper study on this at sometime in the future. So if there's interest in that, just let me know. I'm Pastor Michael Shultz, and I want to thank you again for watching our video. Be blessed.